The AFA is a nonprofit organization dedicated to enriching the public's experience and understanding of visual arts. The AFA has circulated thousands of fine art exhibitions, which have been viewed by well over 10 million people across the country, and in fact globally. The subjects of our current roster of exhibitions include wonderful exhibitions such as Italian masterworks to American Indian art, and we also have an exhibition on the Lega people from the Democratic Republic of Congo. We also have an exhibition on Matisse prints, and we also have an exhibition that examines the sneaker as a cultural icon in today's contemporary world. Our exhibitions are going to be viewed in about well over 40 museums across the United States in the next few years, and I invite you to pick up a brochure this afternoon to learn more about the AFA. I wish to thank our panelists this evening for lending their time and wisdom, and I wish to thank Max Anderson, who's an integral part of the conception of this series, and of course, Kapara Ryan. We could not be here without you, so thank you very, very much. And I wish to thank all of you, the Dallas people, for a warm welcome, actually for this entire weekend with the Dallas Art Fair and so many other activities that the AFA has had this weekend. We also would like to thank the staff of the DMA, including Stacy Lizette, Diane Flowers, Debbie Stack, and Ted Forbes, among so many others. I also would like to extend my appreciation to our partners, the Business and Arts Council of Dallas and their CEO, Catherine Wagner. I also would like to thank the Dallas Art Fair and Chris Byrne, who I think is here this evening as well. They have been enormously helpful in collaborating with the AFA on this event. In addition, I must acknowledge our funders, without whom this panel would not be possible, and they are the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and we've also received generous support from Christie's and the Fairmont Dallas, and as well as ArtNet, who is our media partner. And again, a very special thanks to Kapara, our board member. Today, following today's discussion, we also would like you to do a little bit of work for us and complete a survey. We'd like to hear your thoughts about the panel and about other possible locations on AFA panels. And one of you will receive a little special limited edition moleskin notebook. And we hope you will do that at the end of the discussion. Now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Max, as well as our panelists, to the stage.
Thank you, Pauline.
Come on in.
Thank you so much, Pauline. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming in from a beautiful outdoors to a cool, temperate indoors. And we look forward to spending the next hour and change with you. And especially a privilege to welcome friends to Dallas and a colleague also from the Dallas Arts District. So I'm Max Anderson, as Pauline mentioned, the Eugene McDermott Director of the Dallas Museum of Art, and very pleased to have you with us. We're going to have what I hope will be an informal conversation that I will try to tee up with questions. I hope you'll save some questions yourselves for the latter part of the program that you may have. And I'm going to start with my colleague to my left, my dear friend Susan Taylor, who, as we heard, is the director of the New Orleans Museum of Art. And Susan, just give us a thumbnail to sketch about your background before we get started, if you would.
I have been at the New Orleans Museum of Art for the last 3.5 years as the director, succeeding a long-serving museum director who had been there for 37 years. So it was a really wonderful opportunity to engage with a city and a collection and a community that represents some of the most interesting aspects of culture in America today. Previously, I had only been in academic museums, having been the director of the Wellesley College Museum, later known as the Davis Museum, and the Princeton University Art Museum. So the shift from academics to a city-wide assignment has been very challenging.
So you left the Northeast and you landed in New Orleans, which Adrian was saying before is the least American city he's ever encountered. It doesn't even feel like an American city. Tell us, post-Katrina, a little bit about how the cultural world is faring and some of the aspects of it and health that you feel are necessary as the key protagonist.
I think it's still one of the least American cities in America. It is thriving. It's on a very interesting trajectory at this point in time. It is recovering from Katrina, I would say, in a very positive and interesting way. The cultural communities, however, have stayed very much intact. So I would say that New Orleans as a city defines itself primarily by neighborhoods and populated with people who think of culture in very broad terms. So as we all know, music and food is a big part of what New Orleans is all about, but it's also the social traditions that drive a lot of the activities and festivals and things that we see.
Yeah. Katie Dixon, as the Director of Special Projects at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and is really responsible for the emergence of a district around BAM, and excited to have you with us. Could you give us a little sketch about your background as a city person as well, a cultural executive and veteran of city government?
Sure. Well, I actually started out in architecture and planning and worked in New York as a designer for a while before I started on the most exciting project of my career, working on the BAM Cultural District as a planner with the Downtown Brooklyn Partnership, which at the time had been charged with driving forward the planning for the district. I did a couple of years after that as the chief of staff for Kate Levin, the commissioner of the Department of Cultural Affairs for the city, and I learned about how New York works as a cultural mega power from the city perspective. And now I'm back at BAM, driving forward the development of the district from BAM's perspective and working on our new building projects that are happening and seem to be continuing to multiply despite my planning efforts.
Well, you have a new mayor, and he's very different in cast and character and temperament and planning, I think, from Mayor Bloomberg. And Mayor de Blasio has telegraphed that he has a different agenda. Can you give us a sense of what you're doing to foster BAM and remain top of mind for him, and how the rest of the city's leadership may be looking at this new challenge ahead of a different administration?
I think that the mayor, our new mayor, has actually done a great job at reaching out to the broad spectrum of cultural entities that are in New York City. He's been listening to a lot of different people who are involved in the arts, from the smallest organizations working on a neighborhood level to arts educators in the school system, all the way to the larger institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Met Opera. And everyone is very excited about Tom Finkelpearl, the former director of the Queens Museum of Art's appointment. We think it's a great sign for things to come in New York, given his work in Queens, integrating the surrounding neighborhood with his new renovated museum. He was actually I think he's still the only museum director and maybe the only cultural director in New York to have appointed a community activist as part of his staff. And they've done a great job trying to reach the immigrant community in Queens and really integrate the neighborhood with that place. So I think that Susan actually said earlier, access is going to be the key word in New York going forward.
Mm-hmm. So Kevin Moriarty, who is my colleague down the street and director of the Dallas Theater Center. Kevin, we're in a very different district from New Orleans or Brooklyn. We're a very tidy street with all these magnificent monuments by architects. And we have a totally different vibe in all these respects. And I'm curious how you feel we're moving from simply describing ourselves as the largest arts district to estimates of impact, not just size.
Well, we're a young arts district in so many ways, or at least the completion of our arts district is very new. And as such, I think that is, you can sense that in the air right now, that we are, for the first time, changing our focus as a district away from building buildings and raising the money and envisioning what the district could look like, and instead thinking about, well, now what's it going to do? What's it going to make? What's it going to share? The question about measuring impact is important. The question before that I think is what we're grappling with as a community right now, is what is the goal of the district, which then leads to what are the metrics to to measure that? Is the goal primarily to be judged in economic and community development terms? Is the goal to be to impact the largest number of people in our community or internationally? And or is the metric connected to the caliber of the art itself, the quality of the work, as you would maybe measure through awards or international recognition? So those questions, which also has embedded in it, are we making an arts district for Dallas? Are we making an arts district for the United States, or are we making an arts district for the world? Those are significant questions, and questions that Max and I and the rest of our broader community are really trying to make sense of right now.
Kevin, tell us a little bit about how your background landed you in this great position that you're making such an important theater nationally.
Before coming here, I've spent most of my professional life as a theater director across the country, and I created and ran the graduate theater directing program at Brown University. So I had a experience both as an independent artist and in academia, but neither of those things could prepare me for the amount of excitement and possibility and very broad thinking that's happening here in Dallas right now about the place of arts in our broader civic life.
Rounding out our panel is Adrienne Ellis, who is the founder and principal of AEA Consulting, which is a majestic consulting firm. But also Adrienne has a role here in Dallas, even though he lives and works mostly in New York, which is to direct the Global Cultural Districts Network. Adrienne, would you fill us in a little bit about your responsibilities and also what you've done in the past?
Of course. I'm a Brit, as you can tell, and I've lived in the States since 1998. But for the last 25 years, both in the States and in Europe and other parts of the globe, I've been a consultant working with cultural organizations and a lot with their funders too, both operational and strategic planning for individual organizations and planning on cultural districts. I think there are two other strands of which Max has mentioned one. The first is that for 5 years, between 2007 and 2012, I ran away from my company and ran Jazz at Lincoln Center, which is relevant to the cultural districts discussion because, of course, Lincoln Center itself is a 17-acre cultural district, as we know, in Manhattan. And the Global Cultural District Network, despite the pomposity of the title, is an attempt really to corral leaders of cultural districts, both existing ones and cultural districts that are summoning themselves into existence around the world, to create a forum where they can really therapize, if you like, and share the challenges that they face, not just in getting buildings up, but making cultural districts vital and integral parts of the larger communities in which they're located. So that's my game.
Well, and Adrienne, you're helping us look synoptically at all these challenges, but we have 4 Yankees here to your left, and you have a global vision. You work in Europe and Asia and the Gulf. Can you give us a little sense of what sets the United States apart in thinking about cultural aggregation from the rest of the world?
Well, I had a little notice of that question, and I couldn't think of anything. By which I mean, and I think that's important, by which I mean that America, being the very plural and varied place that it is, doesn't really have a blueprint of the cultural district. And I think that's why it's actually an extremely rich territory for the world to learn from, because there is every conceivable sort of cultural district to be found in the States. Lincoln Center, which we've mentioned, wasn't the first sort of large-scale, multi-facility planned cultural district. I think the South Bank in London beat it by a few years. And indeed, cultural districts, the Museum Island, if you like, in Berlin, started in 1830 and finished in 1930, from the Altes Museum to the Pergamon. But what I think that the States has is good, strong, vital examples of pretty well everything from community-based, bottom-up, highly localized cultural districts to the big towering sort of large-scale districts that have been sort of civic effort that resonate across the world. So I think the great thing about America is it is a very rich and varied learning environment.
Well, all of you travel, and I'm just curious what lessons you might have been taking from travels and thinking about other concentrations of cultural offerings around the world for anybody who might have a thought on that. Do you compare yourself with other cities, Susan, and think about that and look for lessons, or?
Well, we do, but it's interesting because as the one takeaway that I've had, so I consider myself still not looking at New Orleans in a little bit as an outsider's perspective. What I find striking about the city is A, the decentralization of culture, and yet the whole city is defined as a cultural entity. B, that there's an authenticity to it that is from the ground up. So there's no top-down strategy, it's all ground up. So it's the neighborhoods, the various neighborhoods are very clearly defined. And then the organizations value and prize their independence. So the social clubs and pleasure clubs and second-line groups are all committed to maintaining their identity, which is the good news for them, but it's also further complicates how one funds various other cultural offerings. So it's a phenomenon I haven't really experienced before. So I guess I look at that as a different kind of model, and it's not a model that's really able to be replicated because it's so embedded in the history of the city.
Right. Katie, you work next to an island that has a fair bit of culture as well, next to Brooklyn.
I'm not quite sure which one you're...
Yeah, it's another borough in the city of New York. And so how does Brooklyn look at Manhattan? You're now you're the it thing. You are where everyone's moving, you're where the energy is, and Manhattan is becoming a mall for tourists and hedge fund managers who live there.
Russians.
And Russians. So what's Brooklyn doing in respect to that success, do you think, that toggles with this massive influx of talent, youth, energy, imagination?
I think that Brooklyn is really trying to respond to capture as much of that energy as we possibly can. You know, I work at an institution that's been in Brooklyn for 150 years. We're actually the longest continuously operating performing arts center, and so BAM has seen a lot of ups and downs over time. But you know, what's happening in Brooklyn in terms of food, music, visual arts, just the young scene is something that has taken a lot of people by surprise, I think, and trying to have enough space and place for all of that energy to thrive and spill over into, I think, economic development is something that people are hoping to capture in the borough. And I think everyone is really just kind of riding the tide right now.
Mm-hmm. Kevin, we're a very different animal here in the sense that some of what Susan has offered, and Adrian also, is the organic growing up of cultural offerings. And we're, notwithstanding the fact of our not having central government determining their fate like Berlin's Museum Island, what would you say is the unique value proposition in Dallas that's giving energy and has potential, and where are the pitfalls of the way we do it here in expanding a cultural district?
Well, I think one of the things that we have going for us here that is really palpable is because we're in the act of creating it right now, and because our arts district hasn't been created by the government or city planners separate from the arts organizations, it's very much grown up out of the arts organizations, the leaders on our boards, the institutional leaders that preceded Max or me or others in the district. Which means we have a collaborative conversation and openness and dialogue within the district that is generative and fruitful and useful. We spend a fairly large amount of time together as the leaders of the various institutions, and there's a lot of synergy, both in ways that you can see publicly and in terms of helping to lead and determine how the district should grow and develop and what the smartest ways are to do that. So that sense of having the arts organizations at the center of that conversation, leading that conversation, strikes me as a really positive thing. The other thing that you can safely say about Dallas is that we're a growing city, and we are a city that has resources. Those resources are human resources. The many people coming here from all over the world, our thriving economy, and the economic resources that go with all of that. And you can see how resources can be put to bear in really impactful ways by just looking at the architecture along the block. It's stunning. But I do think that that among the challenges that come from that are that our institutions themselves are still creating identities and growing and developing. I don't think any of us are kind of finished or in a final form. I don't think any of the institutions on the block or the district as a whole are looking to maintain the work that they do. I think all of us are still looking to find ways to better serve the community and enrich the community through the highest caliber art. And I think that's an area that's really
I wanted to ask Susan
important.
a question and then take it however you want or ignore it. But an art museum in New Orleans is obviously not at the core of that massive reputation. New Orleans is a place you have to go, you have to have fun, you have to drink, eat, party, live large. How do you make a differentiation and something of consequence about what you're doing and not lose a community focus and spirit?
I think it's interesting and it goes to Katie's point. I wanted to follow up on that. The interesting thing about New Orleans is that it has become this magnet for young people. So over almost 50,000 college graduates have moved to New Orleans in the last 5 years, which is really extraordinary. So it's been recognized as sort of the one place, the brain gain, as Forbes magazine has called it. So the notion of cultural offerings has changed. And it's changed because there are people moving to the city who have expectations that their cultural institutions are going to offer them fare that they will respond to. That being said, given the social media culture that they all live in, those decisions that they make often come at the last minute. So they're going to come, they're going to decide 3 hours before that they're going to come to the museum on a Friday night. We're open until 9, but they come. So it becomes this responsibility of the cultural institution, which, by the way, has never been the driver, the cultural driver in a city, evidenced by the festivals, the parades, the second lines, all the things that you think of New Orleans. But at the same time, that's shifting. And that shift comes with the demand for offerings similar to what they found in Brooklyn when they were doing their summer internships in Brooklyn, or they were thinking about moving to New Orleans versus Brooklyn. So it is changing. And so what we have to do is really create a variety of offerings that engage the spectrum of ages, interests, and take it on and own it. And then because our resources are more limited than a Dallas, the fix that we have found is to really collaborate with other cultural entities. So we have a theater company in residence. We have a film project with the Film Society. We have collaborations with Opera Symphony, everyone, so that we can provide a more expansive view, and that a place like the museum becomes identified as a cultural convener.
Katie, New York City is a world city with tens of millions of affluent international tourists, and Brooklyn hasn't made that so far its primary focus. But in a generation or less, what's the strategy to try to have an international audience keep pace with, or is there one, the growth in a local audience?
That's a great question. New York City topped 50 million tourists, visitors who come annually a couple of years ago. I think we're up to 52 or 3 now. And New York's NYC and Company, our tourism bureau, has figured out that half of those people are coming just for culture. And unfortunately, the Bureau does not track which boroughs they are going to. But what we do know is that for years, Brooklyn has been the destination for international tourists. You can hear almost any language being spoken on the streets of Brooklyn, and that's not just because they live there, but there are people who are coming just to check out the new restaurants and want to see the cool new shopping districts. For BAM and for our district, it's a tricky proposition because our audience tends to be mostly local. We historically had a majority of visitors from Manhattan, but we have in the last 5 years flipped that. So we're now almost 45% Brooklyn-based in terms of our main stage audience. We also have a cinema complex in addition to our 3 main stage theaters, and that audience is almost 90% Brooklyn. I was saying earlier that's our youngest, cheapest ticket price, youngest audience member, cheapest ticket price. I call it our gateway drug. It gets people through the doors and gets them exposed to the other kinds of work that we do at BAM. But we have, somewhere under 10% of our audience on an annual basis is coming from outside of the 5 boroughs. So we tend to have, in terms of our own marketing strategies, a very local push. We're actually bringing the tourists to town. We're bringing the international work to share with our borough and with the city. But it will be interesting to see how that may shift or change as our district continues to develop, and we have more. We are also developing a visual art program that is growing. We're opening a gallery in a few years, as we have different public spaces and other opportunities for cultural offerings in our area, that may change. But that they're still coming. The tourists are in Brooklyn. Max.
Adrian, would you maybe give us some sense of a cautionary tale, or however you'd frame this, that there's so much exuberance around cultural development? There are some failures around the world. There are some experiments that haven't panned out. There are massive bets being made in the Gulf and Asia. What's the advice you give to your clients? You don't have to bill us today, but what would you...
Oh, come on, let me...
What do you start out when you're hired on to tell a mayor in some Chinese city, you can't really do what you're trying to do, or here's what you would need, you don't have it, or good luck to you? What do you say when you're brought in?
It's very, very simple, but it also tends to fall, if not on deaf, then very reluctant ears, and it's that buildings are a means to an end. And unless you're very, very clear about what the ends are, you'll almost definitely get the means wrong. And because buildings are relatively conceptually simple, people start often in thinking about culture in a city with the building. And of course they shouldn't. What they should be thinking about is what sort of city do we want to have, and what does that city need in terms of the things that go on. And then they should think about what sort of things they need to house them. So what is tending to happen around the world, and to some extent in America too, is that the planning of the building runs ahead of, pretty well everything else. So, so instead of thinking about who exactly is the audience going to be, what does that audience want? What are the sorts of things we're going to do in terms of content? What are the strategic partnerships we want to have to get that content? What are the systems of governance for these things? And above all, what are the visible means of financial support, not just for the capital, but for the long-term operating? Those questions, obvious though they are, tend to get sort of shoved aside in the excitement and the immediacy of buildings. So, the lesson to, which is difficult to get across but very important, is think about how this is going to operate and how it's going to be a vital, animated contribution to the city 10, 15, 20, 30 years after it's built. And then think about what you need to get there. And I think that is that remains a very important lesson. In a way, it's almost a facile lesson, because you only have to state it, I think, to think, oh yes, of course. And yet at the same time, the politics of the situation often militate against it being where it should be in the agenda.
Well, none of us would build buildings if we actually knew what they would cost to operate. So
2020 vision kills all projects.
Yeah.
Just a brief anecdote. I was once sitting in one of these big, swaggering planning meetings with a starchitect, as you describe them, on one side, and a client on the other, and somebody else. And I was going through this shtick, if you like, this rather lugubrious account of why they should be worrying about all these things. And the architect went like this: don't you know 2020 vision kills all projects? And there's some truth in that. In other words, people might not embark on these things if they had a full understanding. Is that good or bad? Maybe it's bad, because actually you need, in a sense, to be tricked with systemic optimism into making these things happen. It's a finely balanced equation, but my little piece of the action is to try and tell truth to power. So
right. Well, Kevin, you tell truth to anybody, not just power, but in your incredible performances at the Wiley. I guess I'm curious for you, 6.8 million people in the metro area, fourth busiest airport in the world. What are we supposed to be doing to get either audiences that live far and away from Dallas or who might be at DFW Airport and could spend the night? What are we supposed to be doing to get them to your theater?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think it's one question, and it comes out of Adrian's comment, about thinking about what is the purpose or the goal before building a building or launching an enterprise. In a cultural district, part of what also strikes me as challenging, as compared to just within any one of our institutions in the Arts District, is the question that arises of how important is it that throughout the district that we share those same goals. So, for instance, when you ask about how do we reach an audience from around the country, throughout the region, from around the world, that answer might be very different at Dallas Theater Center than it is at the Dallas Museum of Art or at the Symphony or the Opera or the Crow Collection. And that then leads to how do you take that identity and build upon its strengths and spread it throughout the world. So I think that's a challenge in some ways. I would say, for instance, at the theater, that our work has increasingly become focused on creating work in Dallas that has an impact beyond Dallas that is then goes on to have significant future life in New York or at theaters across the country. And thus far, as a American theater company that creates work here, we have not had a significant focus on speaking to or for or with the international community. That's a function partly of our art form and partly of our own institution's history and partly our mission, vision, values. That may or may not line up in the coming years with the interests and needs and strengths of our other organizations in the Arts District. And it'll be interesting to see not only how do we find those ways to align our goals, but also to see how naturally the strengths of one institution impact another. If we don't see, certainly at the Theater Center and throughout the district, we don't see a significant amount of international cultural-based tourism coming to Dallas at this point. If that were to happen over time, either through the direct result of actions any one of us or collectively that we take, that would definitely start to impact programming in some pretty significant ways. You'd be less likely to present an art exhibit or a play or an opera that you could easily see somewhere else in the country or in the world if you were trying to speak to folks who have those opportunities in their own home cities. On the other hand, if you're primarily regionally based, a focus might really be to figure out how to get some of that important work that folks could see elsewhere here. And so obviously these things are it's not an either or, but the questions are important and challenging questions.
Mm-hmm. Susan, you make artistic choices every day about what to present, what exhibitions to foster, what artists to commission. If you weigh in fundraising for those projects a case to be made for economic impact or for quality of life, and you can't say both, which one wins? Where do you put the emphasis in trying to persuade people to support the artistic mission of your museum?
Well, we have been in a very different place because after Katrina, there was virtually nothing. There was no audience. People had left the city. There had been nothing. So for us, it was all about building back an audience to create a quality of life, to create cultural offerings. So from 2012 to 2013, our visitation increased by 43%, just because we focused on creating cultural opportunities for the people of the city of New Orleans. Now, the bonus piece of that is that other people came, and the tourists, the cultural tourists, who are very different from the people who come for sports and Mardi Gras and all of those things, spend more money and more time. So they come as well. So we've seen this really interesting trajectory. So I guess I would err on the side of quality of life at this moment in time as we're rebuilding our audience in order to create an engaged cultural entity that offers what it should offer to an incredibly diverse group of people in the city of New Orleans. I mean, the population is in Greater New Orleans 50% African American. There's a strong Vietnamese population. There's a strong Hispanic population that moved in after Katrina to fix the city and stayed. There is this very, very diverse group of people that we need to kind of say, look, we're here and we're for you too. So it's a different model, a different moment in time. We are very ambitious with our exhibition program, and we don't exactly have a Chinese menu of offerings, but we're really trying to hit certain high points in order to engage a broader audience.
Katie, same question for you, but also follow-up, which is, you're a leading edge institution so often. You commission major new works, you present them. Your audience is changing. The Manhattanites are diminishing, the Brooklynites are increasing. What's the weight happening for you in more popular fare versus leading edge fare, as well as this economic versus quality of life question? Would you tackle both?
Sure. I'll start with economic versus quality of life, and I will say that we have emphasized economic development because it is bundled with the quality of life issue. It's been hard to separate for us. We talk about in the district all of the new development, the 10,000 new residents that will be in the 2-block radius around BAM, and all of the new amenities that will also come with that development, which include new restaurants, more places to shop, and all of that is obviously improving quality of life, while we also make the argument about economic impact. Jobs have been very important, obviously, in the last several years. But in terms of how we are thinking about diversifying our programming and what we're doing, BAM has been on the cutting edge of showing the most avant-garde work for decades now, and that is our brand, that's what we're known for, and we remain incredibly committed to that. We have really expanded in the last several years in the areas of education and community programming, in part because that has been a way for us to forge stronger relationships with our neighborhood, with the Brooklyn Heights who are coming to our shows. And it's also a need that has shifted over time with all of the new families moving to Brooklyn and the new demographic that we're seeing in our surrounding neighborhoods. We built a new building that opened in 2012, the BAM Fisher Building, that has a new education and humanities floor with classrooms and extra programming space for that work. And I would say that has been the biggest shift for us in terms of our focus and trying to appeal to our immediate audience and neighbors.
Adrian, I'm curious about the newly born cultural districts, the ones that are being planned on a sheet of paper over a lunch, like the ones you go to all the time with developers of great cities. How do they pay for these things? You mentioned that there's a collision course of reality and ambition, but how do they get sustained? Who's paying to run these things?
Well, as you know, the world is tipping, and the world is tipping towards China and Southeast Asia, and the world's tipping to some extent towards South America and the Middle East. And there are governments there with considerable resources. Most of these things are initiated by the public sector. They're not entirely public sector, but they're largely public sector. And when they're thinking about the rationale for them, if you think about what's happening in the growth of cities in that part of the world, those cities are not particularly well differentiated. As capital whizzes around the world and as people whiz around the world, then why would you go there? What is it about that city that would attract inward investment, knowledge workers, etc.? And the list of things is a relatively short one. Public safety is usually top of the list. You're not going to move your family to a city that is unsafe. And next to it usually comes education, transport, and culture. Culture, whether that culture is directly accessed by you or whether you simply want to bring your kids up and your families up in an environment that has access to culture. And I think that's the sort of driver, if you like, to why people are then thinking about how do we create top down, if you like, because of an accelerated pace culture. I'm sure people would like to develop it organically in the same way that the great cultural districts of Paris or London or Berlin arose incrementally over years. But these cities aren't being summoned into existence that way. They're happening much faster. So the coalition, the princes of the city, if you like, who are thinking about these things, are primarily government with developers. There's an interesting sort of wrinkle to that in China that I can tell you about if you're interested. Mm-hmm. But the prime movers are basically, it is a piece of public policy, like health policy, like environmental policy, like transport policy. It is what is our cultural strategy. And the cultural strategy can be to have clusters of cultural, both for-profit and not-for-profit, or there are other cities that are thinking intelligently about delegation and spreading it. But it's basically city-driven. Sometimes national government, sometimes city government. China has an interesting and slightly weird development pattern because, as you probably know, China has asserted an incredibly high target of formation of cultural infrastructure, which is the sort of jargony way of saying building arts buildings. And often the way they do it, is the way they do a lot of development, is basically to clear land, that's pretty euphemistic, to find territory. And then they put out an RFP to commercial developers. And they say to the developers, you can do this, 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 and this, and you can make as much money as you can on these, but you also need to do this, 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 and this. And this, and this happens to be, often in this context, cultural or creative industries, complexes or clusters or precincts or districts. And so you have the dynamic where the driver is the developer. Even though the developer is doing it because it's part of the mandate. That can lead to a tension because the developer thinks about culture as the drag factor. In other words, how much do I have to pay on this stuff? Do I really need to do this stuff? And so that can lead to, it's a rather sort of attenuated process of policy development. There are other enlightened developers who realize that there are enormous synergies to be had between the cultural component and adjacent property development, because clearly culture enhances adjacent property values. So those complex dynamics, and by the way, those dynamics of adjacencies are not unique to China by any means. You only have to go to New York to realize how critically important those sorts of junctures are, and the relationship between the city and the developer in cities like New York, where culture is used by the city intelligently as or planning gain, I should say, and incentives to developers are used so that developers will indeed pay for capital and sometimes operating. So it's a complex cluster, but behind it usually is a public entity with some form of larger public purpose that they're trying to realize.
Can I just jump in, Max, and say that what Adrian's saying is fascinating to me in two ways. One, I would just say that the conversation we've been having about is the primary way we think of our own cultural districts as being that they have economic rationale, or that they have a cultural or artistic or quality of life rationale. Personally, I would say that great art is essential for citizens to be able to understand not only themselves but the world they live in, and therefore you cannot have a successful democracy without not only an informed citizenry but a citizenry that has empathy and that has the ability to hold contradictory ideas in its collective mind and allow those to change and grow and wrestle with each other. So in the case of China, what instantly comes to mind is the question of if great art is inherently destabilizing in exciting, dynamic, meaningful ways, leads to ideas that are new, that are fresh, that change the people experiencing them, then the question becomes, what happens to a government that sets a cultural district in motion, whether that's in Dallas, Texas, or whether that is in a great Chinese city? And at what point does that economic rationale, we need to have more culture in our community, ultimately lead to something that can become destabilizing for the government, either in a way that we would perceive as very positive, or frankly a way that could be alarming.
If you were the artistic director of a Chinese cultural center, I think we'd have a revolution over there in about 5 minutes. I guarantee it. Susan, I want you to respond, but I also want to ask you a question. It's been estimated that there'll be as many as 70, 80 million middle-class English-speaking tourists traveling to the United States from India. So for all of us, I think that's a fascinating question that we face. We can't say, well, they don't.
Is that happening?
What week? Yeah. Brazil is probably in the 40 or 50 million, and then you have China with maybe over 100 million middle-class tourists who are going to come to New Orleans because they will all have been to New York once, and they will all have been to San Francisco. What are you doing to get ready for them?
Okay, well, I want to just say something first I want to respond to Kevin, because the destabilizing factor, there's a flip side to that. And I think one of the opportunities that perhaps the Chinese government sees, or governments see, is the affirmation of their culture, as opposed to so the affirmation and celebration of their culture, which leads to a different response, which isn't necessarily a destabilizing one.
Right.
So I think
But that
may
implies
be
that
the
somebody's controlling
impulse.
that the artists who celebrate stabilizing influences are the ones being seen and heard.
But they're not necessarily artists who are being presented. They're historical materials.
Right.
Many of these museums are the outgrowths of excavations and
Right.
also, so there are all different other ways that I think the
Right.
Chinese are looking at this. The 100 million, the 80 million Indians, I think they're just going to come because they want to hear jazz. You know, there's 120 performances of music every weekend in New Orleans, and that's not during festivals. That's just...
You also have a great Indian art collection.
We have a great Indian art collection, and we have a very strong Indian community for whom we have Indian festivals every year.
So you're ready.
I hope they come for the festivals. But we do have a very strong focus on that.
Katie, how about in Brooklyn, this massive, suddenly available, reasonably affluent tourist audience that is not known to us today?
I think that we are seeing it increasing all the time. Brooklyn had one hotel that was built in 1998 until 2006, when a second hotel arrived. There are 11 hotels that are planned to open by this time next year in Brooklyn. So you're absolutely right that they're coming. But and again, as our district develops and we have more public spaces that need programming and are available in a kind of ongoing way throughout the day to visitors in a different way than a performing arts institution with a set curtain time is now. I think the dynamic between museums and performing arts centers is very different. We are an institution that has to raise between $25 and $30 million every year from individuals, corporations, and foundations in order to do what we do. And so we rely incredibly heavily on being a stable community partner and having relationships with the people who are in our neighborhood, who are in New York City, who are coming to us all the time. Now, I would love to see a tourist tax in Brooklyn that would benefit the cultural institutions.
We love
that are
taxes in
Brooklyn.
Texas.
That won't be happening.
That wouldn't work here, but that could work there.
I just want to follow up on that, because we've had this conversation in the city with the cultural organizations and the mayor's office about the influx of tourists, and we are targeting actually the tourism from South America. Mm-hmm. So the Brazilian, that is where we think the great influx will be.
Yeah, of the million web users at dma.org, Brazil is now creeping up to be the fourth country, and all they're looking at is hours of admission.
And the visas are coming more quickly, and it's just that's our gate. We're the gate. That's our gateway.
Adrian,
opportunity.
Can I ask you about?
Yeah, may I just make one comment on that first?
Please.
We had the privilege to work last year and the year before on anti-tourism policy for Venice. Venice has 45,000 population and 20 million visitors a year. And the visitors bounce off the ships and they bounce around St. Mark's Square and they bounce back onto the ship, have a cocktail. They're none the wiser. They have no idea. They think it's a second-rate Disney. And the question, but also the profile of tourists is changing. And we did a series of sessions with tourist guides who, are at the sharp end of the business. And it was fascinating hearing them say how radically over the past 10, 12 years, the tourist base of Venice as a city has changed. Mm-hmm. Far more Indians, far more Russians, and far, far, far more Chinese. And it's not just how do we cater with increased demand, it's that you will have highly educated Chinese and highly educated Indians who nevertheless are not that familiar, for example, with Christian iconography. So, when you're showing art, where do you start? What's the Holy Trinity, etc.? So, orienting towards new tourist markets and those changes isn't just a matter of sort of, bracing yourself for the onslaught, as it were, nor is it a matter of just, extending capacity or even just, translating your panels. It's actually about thinking, how do you make this material accessible to a new audience who will have, strengths that you're not aware of in understanding things and big blind spots. And I think it will be very interesting to see how, as those new tourist markets develop, people really have to think through what's the nature of the experience they're giving their visitors.
You've estimated there are over 100 cultural districts in formation today with over $250 billion of investment.
Unfortunately, yeah.
My question is there going to be a surfeit that will lead to a problem around this issue of circulation of people? And will a festival model be essential to create a time-intensive attraction versus anywhere you go, there's going to be a cultural district. So what's the big deal? Is there a time-limited notion that needs to be implicated?
There's a lot in there, in that question. Number one is, who are cultural districts for? Dallas's cultural district is not primarily a tourist destination, because Dallas is not a tourist destination. It's there first and foremost to serve its community. It, I'm sure, serves tourists as well, and there's probably a larger tourist strategy for the city which is important and growing. But nevertheless,
but Adrian, we have tourists from Plano, and Plano is 25 minutes north of us, and for residents of that fine city, it's a bit of a commitment to come here. Parking, the tollway.
All right.
So tourism you can read lots of ways.
Okay, so first thing is, these are as often as not big tourist lunges. They are some places. Abu Dhabi, the Saadiyat Island, is clearly a tourist lunge. And the premise is that affluent air traffic through Dubai and Abu Dhabi will increase to such an extent that these institutions will be sustained by that tourist traffic. But I don't think that's the strategy for many of them. Many of them are about cities simply wanting, access to the sort of infrastructure that makes their cities livable. And as the point you made early on, which is, and culture and access to culture, both the production and the consumption of culture, and both not-for-profit, high culture and creative industries is integral to that. So a lot of this planning is about what will serve the immediate community. And of course, if you take a second well-known example that people have talked a lot about, West Kowloon. West Kowloon Cultural District, as they think about that, they're thinking about the millions of Chinese within an hour by high-speed train in the Pearl River Delta. I mean, they are not thinking, oh gosh, how do we get the affluent New Yorker to West Kowloon? What they're thinking about is that immediate hinterland. And if you look in China, as you point out, it's the enormous growth of the middle class, the affluent middle class, who are, and this, this is a very approximate analogy, but it's a bit like America in the 1950s, when people are for the first time, affording a holiday with their family, that's an aeroplane distance away, and they're looking for experiences. So I think that although I think there are going to be isolated, high-profile, spectacular, ghastly examples of misconstrued bad planning where, a little like all those big Soviet, cultural institutions that were dotted around Lithuania and Estonia, etc., built in the 1960s and 70s that had no audience. There'll be a few of those. I think for every one of those, there'll probably be 10 or 15 very, very, heavily used and trafficked, cultural districts.
Kevin, I wanted to ask you a question about the 99%. I mean, I think the Arts District in Dallas was paid for to a large extent by the 1%, is patronized by the 1%. There's this other 99%. which we have to pay attention to every day. What can we do to change the profile of our arts district to be a more open, porous, welcoming, unthreatening space so that not everybody goes to Clyde Warren Park and stays far away from our institutions?
It's a great question, and this goes exactly back, I think, ties into the conversation we've just been having about who is an arts district for, and of course the answers are different for each arts district, but that question is essential if my personal bias about this is that great art that is provocative and dangerous and at times celebratory, that speaks about desire or about freedom or those other kind of fundamental questions, that attracts, that great art that speaks to deep, important truths in a meaningful way attracts people to come to see it, and that isn't necessarily the same thing as chasing any one market. If you just in my area of theater, for instance, in the 1980s, when New York was had a great influx of Japanese tourists, the response of the commercial theater world, and it had a big impact on the for-profit and not-for-profit world, was the rise of the British mega musicals on Broadway that had very, very little content in terms of lyrics. So, Cats or Les Mis, a great show, but not necessarily great lyrics. Not even necessarily, you know what I'm saying. But and that was largely because, in other words, what you saw was a big change in the theater world because the audience base was changing, and that was about where monetary resources were and all of that. But here in Dallas, I think that question is very pressing for us as we grow as a city, as we continue to diversify as a city, and we are rapidly, unquestionably. That question about who is art for, who is our art for, is important. The things that are happening here that give me great hope and optimism, it's what Max has done at the museum, for instance, which is simply to say, let's make the museum free all the time for everybody. Think what would happen in Dallas, Texas, if every single organization in the Arts District, including mine at the Theater Center and the Opera and the Symphony, think what would happen if we all became like libraries, if every one of our institutions was open to everyone for free all the time. My guess is that what would happen is that we would be filled with a more diverse audience, a more engaged audience, and that instantly we would become a city known for being a home of great art with lively, engaged audiences. Now, there's a million reasons why that is almost certainly not going to happen in my time, and don't expect any announcement soon that Dallas Theater Center is eliminating admission prices from our shows. But when you make that flip and start to think about what public libraries have done for America, that idea that all books should be available to all citizens at no cost. Because you are a citizen, you should have access to that. Economic barriers are one way, not the only, not even always the highest reason why, or the most pressing reason why, but they are one reason, one way that one could attack that problem, as the museum has done here.
Thank you. Susan, did I cut you off from an observation?
No.
So we're going to move to questions from the audience. I hope you've spent the last hour coming up with some questions, because otherwise it's going to be very quiet in here. And we have our very first, sir.
How is the New Hall complex and the Museum Tower and Lucy Crow buildings going to have a cultural effect on the art district?
Thank you. So the question was some of the new commercial developments that are coming up on Flora Street, including the new Two Arts Plaza that will be growing up soon, the expansion of the Harlan Crow, the Trammell Crow Center, and Craig Hall's incredible Hall Arts. What are their impact going to be in this? We're very excited about each of these because we work very closely with each of those real estate developers in the Arts District as artistic leaders to foster opportunities for street-level dining, cafes, opportunities for mixed-use retail, residential, to create the infill that really is lacking. We have these magnificent monuments, but now we want pedestrians, we want people to feel, and when we hear people from out of town come say, there's nobody here, they're all in their cars, we want to change that. We want to create that spirit of just people on the street and make it feel more open and welcoming and more like Clyde Warren Park and I think a more accessible place.
More life.
More life. L'chaim, sir.
Okay, Kevin, you mentioned the synergy.
We've got a microphone, by the way, if you don't mind, right beside you.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Kevin mentioned the synergy. How does the competition for money within each of your individual cities interfere, complement, affect this synergy? Competition for money, competition for patrons. And Kevin, if everything were free, how would you pay your performers?
Right. Well, that's a very good question. I'm curious to hear what the other panelists have to say about this question about competition. I would say that in Dallas, this simply isn't a problem. If you were to look at the major donors to the institutions throughout the district, you would find a great amount of overlap. In other words, and if you looked at our audience spaces, you would find a great amount of overlap. That folks who value arts and culture in any one way tend to value it in multiple ways. And so I would say here we tend to find that the more engaged any one individual is as an audience member or as a donor with any of the institutions on our block, the better chance we have that they will also be open to supporting as audience members or as donors other institutions on the block. Do you find that, Max?
I do, and I wonder what Katie thinks about competition in your neck of the woods.
Well, I think that what you're saying is absolutely true, Kevin, that traditionally supporters of culture in Brooklyn have been Brooklyn boosters and supporters of Brooklyn as a town. And as we've seen new performing arts venues open in the BAM Cultural District, they have been organizations that have been around for decades, and they've come with their own donor base. And I think it will be interesting to see how that develops. But right now, we're not feeling competitive with one another. And I think that there is a large swath of the giving community in Brooklyn that is incredibly generous and supports many different organizations and institutions because they're supporting the borough.
Mm-hmm. Another question in the back. If we could go all the way back with the microphone. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Harriet. I actually did move to Dallas from Atlanta to attend law school here 4 years ago. And coming from a city I consider more diverse than Dallas, I think the general perception of most people here in Dallas, maybe amongst my peers, is that Dallas is not quite welcoming to people of color. And so could that maybe be a reason why it's really hard to bring diverse audiences to the arts district? And what suggestions do you all have to make it different? Because when I think about the city of Atlanta, transportation isn't really as great as it is in Dallas, but then we still have all sorts of audiences and places of culture, like the High Museum, for example. And whenever I come to the DMA, I don't see that same diversity. So what suggestions do you all have to make or to attract people of color, maybe of other demographics, to the arts district? Thanks.
Thank you. I lived in Atlanta for 8 years, and I was there as the director of the other art museum in town at Emory University, so I worked closely with the High. Oh, okay. I think...
You knew him.
Yeah. I think that the texture of what we're trying to do today in the last year by, as Kevin mentioned, opening our doors for free and also creating a free membership program, which has signed up over 60,000 people, is actually showing something different. It is showing a much more diverse audience. We have zip codes of everyone who's of the 60,000 who are signing up, and we're seeing a radical shift in how our audience is changing. But then it's easier for us because we're free and we're open all the time, and my colleagues down the street, apart from the Nasher and the Crow, tend to be scheduled in different time of day and have different ticket prices and so on. But I think in Atlanta, the cluster around the Woodruff Arts Center also created a kind of temple of culture, but there were a lot of, and there remain a lot of neighborhood arts groups spread throughout the greater Atlanta area. We tend to be more focused and concentrated with what we're talking about here, but everywhere you look, in Dallas, is in Deep Ellum and Oak Cliff, and moving your way north, there are other cultural offerings. So it's a long-winded way of saying I think the responsibility is shared by a lot of cultural leaders in the city to be responsive to audiences of color and diverse audiences, we're doing our part at the museum. I would hope that that's very much the case elsewhere. And Kevin, I don't know if you have any thoughts. Miss First Lady, Mrs. Michelle Obama gave you an award recently for something you might share in this dimension.
She did. We take this very seriously and are very actively working to make changes in this way. For instance, we have 10 resident acting company members in our institution. 5 of them are actors of color. 2 of them speak Spanish fluently. That's important. It's important to us that the actors on our stage reflect the composition of the city itself, and that the audience represent the composition of the city itself. And that's not just true for actors, that's a very conscious effort as we look at who the writers are, new writers who we're commissioning to create work for us, and established writers from around the country who we're producing here in Dallas, that the artists are as diverse as possible, as well as access points. So that's things like, for us, pay what you can performances, so that economics aren't a barrier. You can pay a penny and come to the theater and sit in any seat you want. But it's not. It's also education is a key component, which is an award that we just received, acknowledging a program we have that brings thousands of DISD students provides them with full subscription, so they see everything in our season, which is quite a variety of complicated work. Not only for free, we also pay for the buses, we pay for pre-show workshops before every show and invite them to engage with the adult audience that are paying patrons of the show afterwards in a conversation with the artist. Those efforts at the school level, at the economic access level, and then at just the question of what art is being represented on the stage. All those things are important. At the arts district level, there are other issues that we can address that no one of us as institutions can do on our own. That has to do with things like transportation, signage, parking options, dining options, visibility, marketing, all of those kind of things as well. And I think together those things all play an important part. I'm curious to hear if anyone else on the panel has responses to that, because that is a question that I'm aware of nationally with our peers who are in arts district. Is the question of can the creation of an arts district unintentionally act as a barrier to full and equal access for everyone in the community?
You bet. I mean, yes, it can. And left to its own devices, it probably will, because of the biases of the current audience of a lot of what you're doing. I can't answer for Dallas. I just don't have the insight. But if you're thinking about planning districts and you're thinking the one thing I want to do is to make sure that this is not a privileged ghetto, a sort of mechanism for sucking money out of the wider community and putting it in, but not necessarily people, then there are 5 variables really. One is the physical design. Make sure that the physical design and related physical access and transport is as welcoming as possible. Think intelligently about your programming. If you're in, let's take another city, Phoenix, and you're not seriously thinking about what you're doing in Spanish, then and you think of Spanish-speaking product as a sort of marketing issue rather than a programming issue, then you're missing the point. The demographics are changing fundamentally and irrevocably, and you need to address that. Pricing is important. It's not critical, but it is important. Witness what's happened here at this museum, and also when you're talking about theatre, maybe not free, but there are great programs like the National Theatre's, £10 or now Signatures $10 program that do significantly alter the demographics of the audience. There is active building of bridges with the wider community, which is again what you're alluding to. In other words, not just waiting and seeing what happens, but having an active engagement with long-term relations with the communities that you want to basically see there. And that's tough because one of the things about educational outreach is it tends to have to follow the money, and the money tends to come in little 3-year dollops. Well, 3 years is not long enough to build a long-term relationship with the community. And then the fifth is just your overall branding and identity. Do you look like this to the outside world, or do you look like this to the outside world? And it matters a lot. And actually, our general sort of graphics and branding and language in cultural institutions tends generally to be a lot more like this than this. And So those are what I'd say the 5 things that one needs to systematically think about when one is thinking about the relationship between a cultural district and that cultural district representing the complexity and entirety of the demographics of the larger community that it's serving.
You know, Dallas has an image from outside which is a bit misleading. 70% of Dallasites were not born in Dallas. 42% of us are Latino. And we have a show of Islamic art next door with labels in English, Spanish, and Arabic. Texas has the 5th largest Muslim population in the United States. So the changing that you were describing earlier about our city that Susan has talked about of post-Katrina audiences changing and residents is an enormous change in what's happening in Brooklyn is of course being written about all over the world. We have time for a couple more questions if they are to be had. Sir.
Katie, a question for you with regard to, especially talking about the Renaissance that's happened in Brooklyn, but talking about downtown Manhattan and sort of the revitalization of downtown and the move of the Whitney, sort of your thoughts on the impact that has and how especially visitors view their visit to New York and not just being in Central Park or Midtown.
Sure. I mean, I'm not sure who said it, but there was a remark about, some people used to say that they would never venture above 42nd Street. That was just too high. Well, now the line has moved down to 14th Street. so the axis of cool, some people say in New York, is shifting toward Brooklyn. I think that it's an indicator of so many different things, but the youth culture really has moved, and the arts has followed, and the tourists have followed as well, because that is where things are happening. And I think it's something that you asked about earlier, Max, how is Brooklyn responding to that, and how are, in the face of Manhattan becoming a sort of weekend place for hedge funders, and tying into some of the immediate previous discussion, how does Brooklyn not become a stultified, overgrown, expensive place that no longer is the home to this vitality that we have seen? Is it just going to continue migrating through on down to Philadelphia, or the 6th borough, as some people have called it, down to Dallas? And I think that's something that is incredibly difficult to answer, specifically for cultural districts. All of the points you're bringing up, Adrian, are fantastic, and it's something that we focus on mainly from the accessibility standpoint of ticket prices and our programming. But I don't think anyone has the answer yet to how you align all of the many forces that need to be in agreement in a city to continue to foster the right kind of conditions for creativity to bubble to the surface on a regular basis the way it is now.
Susan, New Orleans is changing as we speak. What do you see in 10 or 20 years that will be different demographically that will affect cultural consumption in New Orleans?
I think we'll see the 45 to 50,000 young people moving there, staying, becoming really embedded in the community, creating family units and opportunities for young children, which is in the process of being addressed with the education reform movement in the city, the charter school movement, which has taken over many of the schools, failing schools, and it's just a phenomenal story of change. I see that community staying. I don't see the transients. I see a lot of young artists moving to the city because the housing stock is available. It's an interesting place to be. So I see the creativity, the design community, the technology community, the young entrepreneurs community, all kind of creating networks within themselves to advance the city. The city needs that. That being said, there is this tradition, which is, tradition has the positive and the negative. Tradition allows you to celebrate history and histories and multiple cultural narratives, but it also sometimes prevents change. So I think that will be a very interesting tension. I don't think it's a negative. I just think it'll be an interesting complication to the city's already complex.
That is a whole other panel we could do
Yeah.
on that. One more question, if there is one. Over here, ma'am. There's a microphone coming your way.
I guess this is maybe more for the Dallas members of the panel. What is it that, what do you credit for the recent announcement of the 5 students that were accepted to Juilliard?
Well, they were accepted from, as many in the audience know, the Booker T. Washington for the Performing and Visual Arts, which is just down the street, an historic school which gradually grew to become a concentrated school for the arts and had a Brad Klopfil expansion. As a proud Booker T. parent, Jacqueline and I are thrilled that our son is off to Tisch, to the film school at New York University, which is equally competitive in many respects for those who are in the film business. There are, I think, 3 Booker T kids going to Tisch this fall. And I think that nucleus of energy around the school, an incredible faculty, a great commitment on the part of the Dallas Independent School District to foster Booker T as an independent and forward-thinking organization for not only kids, but also for bringing alumni back, for some of our storied, famous alumni in the performing and visual arts, creates an ecology that's exceptional and matched really only with LaGuardia in New York in terms of the output of students. But I think we're very privileged to have that school, certainly as a parent, very proud of what they're accomplishing. And I think it's essential in arts districts, and many are, as Adrienne knows, including educational institutions at the core of what they provide, to make sure there's a diversification of audience from the very young age. I'd like to give the last word, in fact, to Adrian, because he has the broadest view of all of us about what's happening with cultural districts, and whatever big idea we've left out there, I'm sure there are 100, but anything you'd summarize that take us away.
Give me that one in advance. I would only say that I think that I'd only re-emphasize the issue that in the longer term, the question isn't what makes a great cultural district so much as what makes a great vital cultural ecology in a city. And that vital cultural ecology is a pretty complicated mix, because it's a mix of the professional and the amateur. It's a mix of education, production and presentation. It's a mix of different art forms, and it's a mix of the creative industries writ large, from design and film through to the fine arts. And the question really isn't about what's its economic impact or what's its, what are the appropriate metrics to measure it. We have to do that stuff in order to create reports to wave at people to get dollars into it. The real question that lays behind these is basically what sort of community do you want to live in, and what are the cultural attributes of that community? And I think that the physical corralling of culture into a particular area sometimes works. It sometimes works better to have things delegated and pushed around the city in different ways. The thought that I think informs a lot of these discussions is basically what sort of cities do we want to live in, and where does culture rate in that? And I think uniformly, culture seems to rate for most people who think about it in its broader sense very high, and that gives me great grounds for optimism about the future of culture in our cities.
Well, I know you'll all join me in thanking our panelists for coming from far and wide, and Kevin, thank you for coming as well from nearby.
Down the street.
And gratitude to each of you for what you've contributed. It's been a terrific session, and I thank you very much. And I want to thank especially then the American Federation of Arts for taking the chance of putting ArtViews on the road. Pauline, thank you very much. Please give our thanks back to the trustees in New York. And thank you all for coming. There's a reception following now in the DMA atrium. We hope you'll have a chance to stay with us and follow up with some questions for our panelists. Thanks again for coming. Okay.